Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Mangelsdorf, and I am your host this evening. Welcome to this evening's webinar on the journey from isolation to full community inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, presented by Mark A. Keeley, President and CEO of the St. Louis Arc. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker and someone I admire and respect, Mark A. Keeley. Mark has been an advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities for over 40 years. He joined the St. Louis Arc in 1989 as Assistant Director of Residential Services. In 1995, Mark designed the agency's current family reimbursement respite model, which has grown to be one of the largest in the country in terms of numbers of families served and hours of respite provided. In 2008, Mark was promoted to Vice President of Support Services and oversaw children's services, family support, leisure, employment services, and quality enhancement. During his time as Vice President, he helped facilitate the merger of the Bell Center in 2012 to form the Bell Children's Services of the St. Louis Arc. Mark became President and CEO of the St. Louis Arc in July 2015. It seems like yesterday to me. This past year, Mark received the Executive Excellence Award from the ARC of the U.S. National Conference of Executives in recognition of his leadership. He is a licensed clinical social worker and holds a master's degree in social work from George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University. And without further ado, I am turning it over to Mark Keeley.
Thank you very much, Ann. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I appreciate this opportunity to share with you this perspective and some of the research that I've done over the years, and also just share some personal stories about my own journey in my career. This is a chronological or a look at inclusion as it pertains to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As such, there is going to be language that I will be using that was previously used that is no longer used. I have made edits where that is appropriate, but there are some places where I kept it as the original language to be historically accurate. I tell you this because I don't want anybody to be offended by language I use. I'm very well aware of the power of language, and I don't mean for any of it to be offensive. So let's start with how I got involved in this field. It dates back to high school. In 1979, there was an all-school assembly, and I grew up in Michigan. And at the assembly, they said, if you volunteer for this event on Friday, you get out of any assignments you have, including exams. And I had a math test, and I'll be honest, I didn't like high school math. And so I volunteered for this event, which I didn't know what it was. It turned out it was the Special Olympics. So I went and volunteered at the Special Olympics on that Friday. And my job there was sort of pictured in this slide right now. I stood on a track in one of these lanes at the end of the lane, and my role at that time was called hugger. And I would, anybody that ran down my lane, I would hug them, congratulate them, and put a medal over their neck. Didn't matter if there was first place or 100th place, they got a medal and they got a congratulations. And I really enjoyed getting to know the athletes that day. And I started talking to them and saying, hey, are your folks here? Are they cheering you on? Is your family here? And one after another said they didn't know. They had never met their parents, that they had lived in institutions their whole life. And that was a concept that was so foreign to me. I'm the 7th out of 8 children. I grew up in a very large family, and I couldn't imagine growing up not knowing a family. And so I started asking questions about who advocated for them and you know who was helping them. And one after another they were not able to answer my questions about that. So at 16 years of age, I decided that that's what I was going to do for a living, that I was going to be an advocate for people with developmental disabilities. Within a few months, a few weeks, I started working and a respite center in my hometown that was an old converted one-room schoolhouse, which was used on the weekends for families to drop off individuals with disabilities to spend the weekend. The first person that I worked with was one of two gentlemen named Michael, and you'll hear about both of them tonight, that helped shape my career. But the first Michael was just 2 years younger than me, a really nice guy. He had, if life had been different, he would have been, as he told me, a motorcycle riding, leather wearing guy with lots of tattoos. But unfortunately, he was born with severe cerebral palsy and had a lot of physical constraints. So he was only able to use his right wrist, and he could move his head slightly, and he could move his eyes. And so the way he communicated was you would sit across from him, and he had a clear plexiglass board that you clipped onto his wheelchair, and he would spell out words looking at the letters of the alphabet on the clear plexiglass board. And that's how you communicated with him. And I was taking care of him, and I put the board on, and he spelled out, "You're a jerk." And I was surprised by that. And I said, "Well, what did I do?" And he pointed out to me that I was teasing my coworkers, but I was not teasing him, that I was treating him different than I treat other people. And immediately it dawned on me that I need to see him as a person and not as a person with a disability. And so Michael taught me right away, just stop looking at me the way you're looking at me, look at me as a human being. And so we became very good friends, and he taught me a lot in the time that I worked with him. Shortly thereafter, I started working in a group home in my hometown. It was one of the first group homes where the institutions in Michigan were starting to empty out, and we were bringing folks home. And I worked in a large group home with 4 gentlemen and 2 women. I got a bachelor's degree in social work from Western Michigan University, where all of my research focused on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and supports for their families. And then I moved back to my hometown and worked for 2 years for the state of Michigan. And my role there was to shut down the institutions and move people out into the community. And that was a challenging job, because some of those folks that were coming out of the institutions were friends of my parents who had sons and daughters that I knew nobody else knew about. And I had to share with them that we were bringing their sons and daughters home. A challenge for a lot of them, to realize that I knew something that they had never shared with anybody else. In 1987, I came to St. Louis to get my master's degree in social work. I had looked at all the different social work programs around the country, and all the different programs were using textbooks that were being produced by Washington University. And so I thought I would come where the research was being done. And as a part of my education, I did my first practicum here at the St. Louis Arc. And then my second practicum, I worked at the Productive Living Board, a local SB 40 board funding source that funded some of the programs here at the ARC. And then when I graduated, the ARC hired me. I've been with the ARC for nearly 33 years now. And I've worked in, as Ann said, pretty much every department of this organization at one point in time or another. When I was over quality enhancement, that put me in every area of the agency. For those of you who aren't familiar with the St. Louis Arc, we provide services and supports to over 4,500 individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities throughout the lifespan. We have various programs that help people in different stages of life. And our goal is to help people live their best possible life. This presentation I'm giving to you tonight is about the journey of inclusion, but it will include many personal stories, as I've already started to tell you. So when we start looking at the history of inclusion, it starts with, depending on the era, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been dehumanized. They have been seen as wholly innocents or menaces to society, as less than human, as burdens to society. Really, depending on the era, there were different definitions of a person with a disability. But typically what they did was they tended to view people with disabilities as a group rather than as individuals. When you look at a group of people, it's easier to dehumanize them and to take away the things that you would see in an individual and just group them as, classify them as a group. Throughout history, people with disabilities have been viewed in different ways. In this picture, I show the holy innocents, God's fallen angel, there on the left, and the court jester on the right. And the court jester, I put that in there because many of you have probably seen depictions of olden times when royalty had court jesters to entertain them. Well, court jesters originally were people with disabilities that they were just laughing at. Well, some of them were talented and could juggle and things like that, but originally that's not what they were using. They were using people with disabilities that they just chose to use for their own amusement. So when you lump people together as a group, it's easier then to devaluate them. Over time, there's widespread view that people with disabilities lack any human feelings, any emotions, or intelligence, or physical sensations, or emotional sensations, and consequently, they put less value on them. Now, when I talk about that, I don't want you to think that this was 100 years ago. When I started here at the St. Louis ARC, there was a group of us in the early 90s who went to some local funding sources that shall remain nameless to present some information about a sex education program that we wanted to start for people that we support. At that time, the boards had representations from the local archdiocese on there. And independent of one another, those representatives indicated to us that people with disabilities have no sexual feelings, have no emotions about that, and that we were pushing our perversions off on them. That was not that long ago, folks, that people were talking that way. And there's still some folks that believe that. So it's important that we understand as I talk about some of these things, while there's been progress, there's still a long way to go. This is the other Michael in my life. This gentleman I met when I came to work at the St. Louis ARC. His mother is a dear, dear friend of mine. And I am actually his backup guardian if anything happens to his mother. But historically, people with disabilities and their families have been isolated from the rest of society, sometimes to protect society, sometimes because they want to remove the disturbing reality of seeing somebody with a disability. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. But it's easier to think of, to avoid things if you don't see them, right? So for those of you in St. Louis, you may know of the Old State Hospital, which is on Arsenal on the Hill of the Italian section of town. But when that was built in 1869, that was way out in the country. And it was designed to remove people with disabilities and put them away from society. It was, and I'll read this because it's the historical fact about the state hospital. Originally known as the St. Louis County Insane Asylum, the model of treatment at the hospital's inception was known as the moral model. It emphasized the opportunity for parents to escape the pollution, rigors, and stresses of city life and seek comfort and sanctuary available in a pastoral asylum setting in which patients could look down upon rolling grasslands, have fresh air, sunshine on their faces, and participate in meaningful and restorative work, and above all, be treated with dignity and respect by the staff who cared for them and all of whom lived on the grounds with the residents. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Sounds like a place that we'd all want to live. But really, in reality, it was moving people way out in the country and away from anybody else in society. This was a common thing. Prior to 1950, a lot of most doctors inform families if they had a child with a disability that they should put that person in an institution and forget about them. That they would be a burden to them, they would not have a long life, they would not have a meaningful life. And most parents did what we all do, which is trust our medical professionals, and they put their sons and daughters in institutions, thinking that that was the best thing for them. You must understand, when I tell these stories, I am not being critical of any parent or any parent's decision. I am not a parent. I have not had to face any of these decisions. I am just trying to present what the history of this was. Michael here in this picture is the son of my friend Mary. Mary had Michael when she was 17 years of age. And he was born in early November. And the doctor immediately noticed that he had Down syndrome and said he will die before Christmas, but that you should put him in an institution so you don't have to deal with that. Mary, at 17 years of age, his biological dad came in and saw him and walked away, and that was the last time Michael saw his biological father at the hospital. And after that, Mary raised him on her own, and she took him home and she said, no son of mine is going to be separated from me. I will raise him. A quote from Mary in terms of isolation says, I have many photos of Michael as a little guy, but only a couple of them with us together. Michael and I were alone in his young years. Family lived elsewhere, and photos of Michael were taken by me. Thus, I'm not in them with him. We weren't invited to any barbecues or parties or any everyday happenings that when you have a child with a disability, often your friends disappear because they don't know what to say. That is still a problem and a common theme that we hear from young parents saying, all my friends disappeared when they found out that I have a son or a daughter with a disability. Mary was talking about this back in 1961. When she made the video of Michael's 40th birthday several years ago, she said all these memories came back to her, and there were no photos of Michael having playmates or friends when he grew up. And it was hard for her to see that. But then she told the story, and I'll get into our early childhood program, Child Garden, later in this presentation, but she later in life, she took Michael when he was in his late 20s to see our inclusive daycare center, Child Garden. And they walked around the school, and Michael was able to see children with and without disabilities together. And Mary said to him that, see, Michael, all the children are together and they're happy and they have friends. Michael, who has limited speech and limited vocabulary, held her hand afterwards and said, honey, I understand. And she said, that was the end of him blocking out his childhood. He never wanted to look at pictures of him as a child before that. But after seeing that other children with disabilities now have friends, he was able to start looking at his own childhood pictures and be happy about his childhood. There was, for a long time, the issue that having a disability was a crime. It was from the 1860s until the 1970s, where several cities had ugly laws, making it illegal for persons with unsightly or disgusting disabilities to appear in public. These were known as unsightly beggar ordinances. And the goal of these laws were to preserve the quality of life or perceived quality of life in the community. The most famous of these, often cited, was in Chicago, Illinois. And the Chicago Ordinance of 1911 was in municipal code, and it said the following: no person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed, so as to be unsightly or disgusting object or improper person, to be allowed in or on public ways or public places in this city, or shall therein or thereon expose himself to public view under penalty of not less than $1 and no more than $50 for each offense. This law was on the books in Chicago until 1974. During my lifetime, this was a law. And people thought that that was an okay thing. What I will say to you is there are still things on the books that are not as overt as this, but many towns and municipalities have disbursement laws, and they have rules on the books, laws on the books that of who can live in those municipalities. When I was looking for a house 20 years ago, I had to have a real estate agent who understood the laws of the different municipalities, because I was moving in with my partner, who I was not married to, and many of the municipalities have laws that say you cannot have two people that are not related by blood and not married living in the same dwelling. So while it's not as obvious as saying that being out in public because you have a disability is a crime, there are still things that prevent people from being a part of society. So in 1950, there were brave parents such as Mary, and this is one of the few pictures of Mary and Michael together, where they chose to go against what the doctor said, and they decided to keep their sons or daughters at home. What was happening then was that many of the folks started running into each other in public settings at the parks or grocery store or whatever, and they realized they had something in common, and they started to get together and do some recreational things together, and have fun, and also talk about what services and supports their sons or daughters needed or were not getting, and how they could advocate for that. In 1950, there was a conference up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that two parents from St. Louis drove up to. And it was a conference for parents of children with disabilities, something that had never been done before. That conference was the birth of, and was started by, what was then known as the Association for Retarded Children. It later changed its name to the Association for Retarded Citizens, and over 25 years ago, that acronym was dropped and became ARC, such as the St. Louis ARC. So those two parents from St. Louis went up there, and they were really excited about what they learned, and they decided to come back to St. Louis and see if they could find any other parents that would be interested in starting a chapter of the ARC. And so they put an ad in the Globe Democrat and said, if you're a parent of a child with a disability and you would like to network with other parents with children with disabilities, come to this meeting. And they set up a room with 15 chairs. They didn't really expect 15 people, but 150 people showed up that first night. And that was the birth of the St. Louis ARC. So we were born the same year as the National ARC was formed. And those parents started talking about things that they needed. So immediately they started some early intervention classes, some physical therapy, some speech classes, but they also did some recreational things. They did bowling, which we still do today, and they did square dancing, which we don't do anymore, but we do have other dances when there's not a global pandemic. Mary was told when Michael was born, you can take him home, but he won't live to see Christmas. You'll learn that Michael is still alive today and still doing well. But that was a brave thing for a 17-year-old woman to do, to decide to care for a son with a disability. And he has Down syndrome, and corresponding with that, there were some heart issues that required surgery, and Mary took it all on and said, he's my life and I will do whatever it takes to raise this boy. So from the 1950s and 1960s, there were all sorts of change movements where people were fighting for civil rights and advocating for human rights of all kinds. I've listed several of the movements here that existed in the 50s and 60s. If you've not seen it, there's an excellent documentary on Netflix called Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. Again, a name that I would not have chosen. But actually, when you watch the documentary, that's what those individuals with disabilities called this camp that they went to. And what the camp was really an opportunity for them to realize that they were not alone and that they had an opportunity to start making changes by advocating for serious rights for people with disabilities. So if you get a chance, this documentary was produced in 2020. Again, it's on Netflix and it's called Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. All of these movements listed here created momentum for change for people with IDD. The changes were small at first. So in 1950, Mary Switzer was the head of vocational rehabilitation. For those of you who don't know what Voc Rehab is, they actually fund early childhood services, but they also fund employment services. And she was the director back in 1950, and she emphasized that independent living was a quality of life issue, important for all of us to have a good quality of life, is that we need to be able to be independent. And to be independent, you have to have a job or some income of some sort or win the lottery. But she was one of the first people to indicate that people with disabilities need to be independent. It's a quality of life issue. Throughout the 50s, there were several Social Security changes that expanded services for people with disabilities. That's when SSDI was started for disabled workers, and other Social Security amendments were made throughout the 50s and 60s. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy appointed a special panel, the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. Again, the language is reflective of the time, and it is what it was called at that point in time. The reason why President Kennedy was interested in people with disabilities was he had a sister, Rosemary, who was 16 years his junior, who was born with an intellectual and developmental disability. He asked this panel to evaluate where we were as a country with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and to determine what changes we should be making as a country to improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. So in 1962, the panel created a report, a blueprint. Actually, it was 1963 when he assembled them in 1962. And in 1963, they presented a report, a special message to Congress on mental illness and mental retardation. And he announced a bold new approach to intellectual disabilities. He outlined recommendations from the panel, including new programs for maternity and prenatal care, initiatives from moving away from custodial institutions to community-centered agencies, and plans for construction of research centers where people could be evaluated, diagnosed, and given clinical services and treatment services. He emphasized the importance of special education, training, and rehabilitation. In 1963, President Kennedy called for a reduction over a number of years in hundreds of thousands in number of individuals with mental illness and developmental disabilities to be moved out of state institutions. Again, that was 1963. I mentioned earlier that I worked for the state of Michigan from 1985 to 1987 to start moving people out of the institutions. So over 20 years later, we were just getting around to it in Michigan. I can tell you today in Missouri, there are still several hundred individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who live in institutions in this state. So we haven't finished what President Kennedy set out to do in 1963. So there were more steps as we moved into the 70s. Excuse me, if you've not seen it, Geraldo Rivera, this is how he got his claim to fame early in his career as a reporter, is he did an expose on Willowbrook Institution, which was a state-run school in Staten Island, New York. And you can still see this video and see videos about this expose on YouTube. And I encourage you, if you've not seen it, to do that. But it was the first time that anybody had really truly exposed what an institution was like back then. And what we saw and what you'll see in those videos is individuals with disabilities sitting in large rooms, completely naked, rocking, no interaction, nobody checking on them. There was a lot of self-stimulation. There were people sleeping, curled up in a fetal position. There was feces everywhere. Obviously not a good quality of life. And that was what President Kennedy was saying, is we need to get away from that kind of life. But it was actually Geraldo Rivera's expose that really started people to look at that and to understand what we were talking about when we talked about institutional care. In 1972, the Social Security Administration created what is now known as SSI, that relieved families of the financial responsibilities of caring for their adult sons or daughters with disabilities. So if you have a son or daughter with a disability who is 18 or older, they qualify for SSI payments, which enabled them to be a little more independent and to help cover the cost of their care. In the mid 70s, in 73, you'll see that there were several key changes to the language of the Rehabilitation Act that said no otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall, solely by the reason of their handicap, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. This was really important to say that if you're receiving any sort of federal funding, you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities, and they should have access to everything. It was in 1973 that we first started seeing handicapped parking stickers, which were first introduced in Washington, D.C. At the end of the Vietnam War, we had many veterans coming home, and the vets returned home to a less than warm welcome. Many all made sacrifices. Many lost their lives. Others came back needing significant supports. In 1972, Paralyzed Veterans of America, the National Paraplegic Foundation, and Richard Hedinger filed a lawsuit against the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority to incorporate accessibility into their design for the new multi-billion-dollar subway system being built in Washington, D.C. Their victory was a landmark in the struggle for accessible public mass transit in a major city. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you know that that system works very well for people with mobility issues. But that did not happen without a lot of advocacy and lawsuits to make it happen. So as we moved through the late 70s and early 80s, we had some positive things happen. The education of all handicapped children, which became known as IDEA, was passed in 1975. And the IDEA, if you don't know what that is, says that the majority of children with disabilities are now being educated in their home schools in their neighborhood schools in regular classrooms with their non-disabled peers. High school graduation rates as a result of IDEA have gone up dramatically since that was passed. And today there are post-school employment rates for people with disabilities as a result of IDEA are twice those of older adults who were before IDEA existed. The employment rates were very low, and after IDEA, while employment rates for people with disabilities still remain low, they're significantly higher than they were prior to that. Also, post-secondary enrollments among individuals with disabilities receiving IDEA services have also sharply increased. For example, the percentage of college freshmen reporting disabilities has more than tripled since 1978. In 1978, as is noted here, the ADAPT was founded, which was forcing the issue about having accessible transportation in major cities. People were chained, and the example I put here is people chained themselves to buses in Denver for days at a time to prevent the public transportation buses from moving until they purchased a wheelchair lift equipped buses. This not only happened in Denver, it happened all across the country, including here in St. Louis and in Tennessee and Kentucky. Folks with disabilities were fed up with public transportation not providing access for them. And so rightfully so, they fought for and achieved that, and ADAPT still exists around the country and still advocates for the best possible transportation options for people with disabilities. In 1981 to 1984, President Reagan at the time decided to terminate a lot of Social Security benefits for hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities. And as a result of that, many of those folks committed suicide. It was a way of saving money, cutting expenses in the country's budget. And as a result, we lost a lot of incredible people who could not afford to live without those benefits. There were a lot of protests about those cuts, but they went through anyways. Ironically, 1981, when he started doing this, was the International Year of Disabled Persons. And that was, again, international. So countries around the world were encouraged to sponsor programs bringing people with disabilities into the mainstream of their society. Our president chose to do the opposite. 1985 brought more rights and more opportunities. So the voting accessibility for elderly and handicapped mandated that all polling places must be accessible. You'll see that to this day, that all voting places are accessible. There are typically booths, if they're using booths, or machines that are lower for somebody in a wheelchair. We are allowed to provide supports to people in a polling place if that is necessary. Also, in 1985, the US Supreme Court ruled in this case listed here that localities cannot use zoning laws to prohibit group homes from people with developmental disabilities being in residential areas solely because they were disabled. So that was in 1985. I can tell you the St. Louis Arc opened many homes in 1989 and 1990 throughout the metropolitan area, and every time we were greeted with angry neighbors and county councils and city councils that were saying, no, you can't be here. And we had to cite this court ruling saying, yes, we have every right to be here. A lot of municipalities created disbursement laws, which this was their way of preventing multiple group homes. So what they would do is say, all right, you can be here, but no other group home can be within 25 miles of your group home. which typically for most municipalities meant that they would not have any more group homes because most of them did not have that radius. So this was their way of saying, okay, well, we have group homes, but really it was just one group home. There were many, many lawsuits and many fights to enforce this ruling by the Supreme Court from 1985. We had so many meetings where people misunderstood when we were coming into the neighborhood. They thought that we were bringing criminals into the neighborhood, that everybody that we supported were rapists, and that it would drastically decrease their property values. Well, I can tell you that all of the agencies across this country that are accredited, like the St. Louis Arc is, have so many standards that we have to comply with, that our houses are typically the nicest homes on the block because we can only have grass so long, we can only have bushes so high. There's a lot of things that govern that make us really great neighbors, but it is a shame that we had to always fight to be there. When I first started with the agency and we had opened a group home, or we had bought a home in the community, they asked me to live in that home before we were able to get the funds to renovate the home. So I lived in that home for 10 months to make sure that none of the neighbors burned the house down while we were waiting for funds to renovate the house. I would leave every morning at the same time that the neighbor that had a driveway alongside ours. And I would say, good morning. And every night he and I would get home at the same time. And I said, hope you had a nice day. And never once would this man acknowledge my existence. He was furious that we were moving into the neighborhood and that we were going to ruin his property values, and he would never, ever be able to sell his house. However, we've been in that neighborhood since 1990, and he remains our neighbor. So hopefully he's understood that his fears were for naught. In 1984, the Bell Center opened in St. Louis, and this was one of the first truly inclusive daycare centers in the country. The philosophy of the Bell Center was that peers should grow up together and they should get to know each other, and they should be receiving early education services in an inclusive setting where children with and without disabilities are in the same classrooms, learning the same things with the proper supports. They were a leader in this field. In 1989, the St. Louis Arc opened Child Garden, Child Development Center, which was also an inclusive preschool. It was, again, 5 years after the Bell Center. But we also believed in inclusion and wanted children with and without disabilities to grow up together and to be in the classrooms together. And we believed in that mission. In 2012, the St. Louis Arc and the Bell Center merged to become the Bell Children's Services of the St. Louis Arc. We did end up closing Child Garden in the fall of 2019, actually just before COVID hit. And the reason for that was we really had to achieve the mission of inclusion. Most, if not all, daycare centers now take children with disabilities. When we started, when the Bell Center started, none of the other daycare centers would take a child with Down syndrome or with any type of disability whatsoever. But now most of them do. And so what our mission is to go into some of those daycare centers now and provide the supports that they need to be successful to support those children in an inclusive environment. In 1990, President Bush did an amazing thing by signing, and this was something that he really said he was set out to do. He signed the Americans with Disability Act, which provided comprehensive civil rights protection for people with disabilities. It was closely modeled after the Civil Rights Act, and the law was the most sweeping disability rights legislation in the history of this country. It mandated that all local, state, federal governments and programs be accessible, that businesses with more than 15 employees provide reasonable accommodations for disabled workers, and that public accommodations such as restaurants and stores make reasonable modifications to ensure access for disabled members of public. The act was also mandated access in public transportation, communication, and other areas of public life. I remember when this passed, and one of my brothers, I have 5 of them, one of my brothers was in city government in Los Angeles, actually. And he just was so furious that this was going to cost so much money, and that there was no reason to make accommodations for a small percentage of the population. He and I disagreed on this issue, and actually, when I started presenting the facts to him, he sort of changed his mind. His stance was a stance of a lot of politicians and a lot of major cities and major businesses saying it's so expensive to make these modifications. Well, in the end, they all made them, and they increased the number of people that were active in their communities. And they increased the number of people going into restaurants, into businesses, because they had access now to do that. It was a win-win for everybody, and President Bush was credited with this and deserves all the credit for passing that. In 1999, the Olmstead Act, the Supreme Court ruled that individuals with disabilities must be offered services in the most integrated setting. Many individuals who lived in institutions or even nursing homes prior to Olmstead were given the opportunity and given the right to move out of those settings into the least restrictive setting, which for many of them meant moving into a smaller home with 1 or 2 other residents, to moving into their own place, or moving into a group home. A lot of states did not and still do not comply with the Olmstead Act, and it's required a lot of advocacy from families to fight these issues and to advocate for better services. This picture has nothing to do with that. This is Mary and her son Michael at his 40, he was in his mid-30s there, and his friend Dan, who is no longer with us, but those two were inseparable best friends who were strong advocates, and Mary and Michael continue to be strong advocates in the disability movement. In 2010, most of you should be aware that President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, which many people call Obamacare, which offered affordable, accessible access to health care for all individuals, all Americans. And many states, including Missouri, have passed legislation to require insurance companies to provide services for people with autism, to help fund their supports that are required for young children with autism. There have been many attempts by folks to overturn the Affordable Care Act, but so far it has withstood all of those challenges, and more people in this country have access to health care, including people with disabilities that could not afford it before, can now have reasonable health care. In 2014, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, known as CMS, don't ask me why, it's 2 Medicaid and Medicare services, but they only put 1 M in there, but it's CMS, issued what they call the final rule on home and community-based services. requiring that all settings for services are integrated and allow full access to the community. The final rule became effective on March 17th, 2014. However, there were delays in certain parts of it, and the final implementation of it really just occurred within the last year or two. But a lot of it applies to person-centered planning process and the home HCBS services. In the rule, CMS clarifies and outlines expectations for the person-centered planning process, which increases the person's input into how services are planned and what is included in each of those plans. It also described expectations for the home and community-based services settings, which increases protections relating to where people receive services in the community and ensures that people are afforded opportunities to be fully integrated into their communities. This picture here is Michael, and he is no longer mobile, so he uses a wheelchair for mobility. The gentleman on the right is Paul, his physical therapist. Michael actually, prior to COVID, was no longer able to bear weight. Prior to that, he was able to transfer out of his chair into his bed and into other chairs, but he could no longer bear weight. And so he spent 17 months in bed working with Paul, this physical therapist, to build up his strength and to finally get back out in the community. This picture was just taken a few weeks ago at his favorite Cold Stone Creamery, where he goes to get a milkshake every Wednesday afternoon. This is Camilla, who was brand new there that day, but Michael was bummed not to see his friend Gloria. He has relationships with his community. People know him by name. He lives in Southern California, in Oceanside, California. There are a couple of restaurants outside his condo, and he has a nice balcony, and one of them plays music, and whenever they see him out on the balcony, they play certain music because they know it's his favorite song, and they shout up to him. That's the kind of life that you want for anybody, and Michael has had an amazing life because of his mother always ensuring that he was active in his community, that he got out and got to do the things that he enjoys doing. The ABLE Act was started in 2014, and what this is it is ABLE accounts are an investment account available to any individual with disabilities, eligible individuals with disabilities. It allows individuals to save money and invest money without losing their eligibility for their public benefits such as SSI and Medicaid. Earnings are not subjected to federal income tax as long as you spend them on qualified disability-related supports and services. So they can spend things, spend the interest on food, clothing, personal care items, housing, transportation, education, assistive technology, and personal support, employment training, healthcare related expenses. The maximum contribution that anybody can do into an ABLE account on an annual basis right now is $16,000. And if they're employed, they can actually contribute an additional $12,880. So if the person has a job, they are able to contribute up to $28,880 annually into this ABLE account. They can save a maximum of $517,000 annual in a lifetime to use for those expenses that I mentioned. Again, this was an amazing achievement, and Missouri has the MOABLE Act, which allows Missourians to do this, and it allows people to have a little bit of savings and not have to worry about, if I'm going to need dental insurance, dental work, or if I need hearing aids, how am I going to pay for that? So they can save up for that and not be penalized and not lose their benefits. The St. Louis Arc offers many workshops on the ABLE Act throughout the year. And if you want, you can visit our website at www.slarc.org. And you can see when our workshops are offered. And also our family support department, Ann Mangelsdorf, who introduced me, can tell you more about ABLE accounts and any of those types of services. Also in 2014, there was a major employment law change, which a lot of folks still aren't aware of, but any businesses that have federal contracts, receive federal funding, must now are now required to set goals to employ up to 7% of their population, their employees should have a disability. This includes your local universities that get federal contracts, any businesses that get federal contracts must have 7% of their workforce should have a disability. The law permits companies to invite employees to self-disclose a disability, allowing the company to conduct an internal census. With this data, companies can make sure they are recruiting and hiring processes do not inadvertently exclude qualified candidates with disabilities, but no employee has to disclose a disability unless he or she wants to. This rule change stems from an effort to combat chronic unemployment for people with disabilities. Most recent data, well, actually, there's more recent data than what I have listed here, but the unemployment rate for non-disabled Americans was at the time that I wrote this about 8%. Well, people with disabilities was more than double that, and that has typically been the case throughout time, where people who have disabilities are experience unemployment at a greater rate than people without disabilities. I threw this in because I love this quote. This gentleman actually participated in the most recent Boston Marathon, and this was the runner that ran with him. And his mother posted this, and his mother is a friend of my friend Mary, who's the mother of Michael. And I thought this was a great quote. Inclusion doesn't mean you pay to sit at the table. Inclusion means you are invited to the table because you earned it just being you. You deserve to be at the table because of who you are. Your worth is not measured by dollars, dearest son Liam. It's measured in how far you promote inclusion by occupying space in this world. Continue to do that and show the way for Dad and I. Remember the crowds that celebrated you. And you can actually go online and do a search for Liam in the Boston Marathon, and you can just hear the roar of the crowd as he is running through there. He was one of the first people with disabilities ever to run through the Boston Marathon. So as I said at the beginning and throughout this presentation, we still have work to do. Here's Michael, my dear friend, and his mother, Mary. We celebrated Michael's 60th birthday in November, but due to COVID, he had not left his home in over 17 months. Now that picture that I just showed you with Paul as PT and Camilla at the Stone Cold's Creamery across the street from his condo is new. He had not been out of the apartment in 17 months. His mother, Mary, remains his primary caregiver. She has 4 people that come in and assist Michael throughout the week for very short periods of time. Paul being one of them, but his contract actually just ran out this week and he will not be renewed, even though Mary adores him. But Michael no longer qualifies for the physical therapy services. Because he cannot bear weight, Michael spends about 90% of his day in a hospital bed. which he has to use a Hoyer lift to get in and out of that into his chair. And Mary is responsible for that care. She also happens to care for her husband, who during COVID has been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia and Parkinson's and is rapidly declining. As I said, she has those 4 aides to help her periodically through the week, but that's not enough, and it's not a sustainable plan. Due to COVID and the care required by Michael, Mary had not been out of her condo in 19 months when I went to see him for his birthday. And I forced her to come out with me for 2 days. It was good for her and terrifying for me in that I would be driving and she'd scream, "Oh, look at that." And I would like jerk the wheel and she's like, "There's the ocean." It's like, yeah, no, the ocean hasn't left you. It's still here. You just haven't been out to see it. She literally lives 2 blocks from the ocean and had not walked out of her condo to go down to see the ocean for fear of COVID and because she did not feel like she could leave her son or her husband alone during that time. While we can look back and see lots of progress in the areas of inclusion, it's important to note that families still feel isolated. Mary absolutely feels isolated. I would do more for her if we lived in the same town, but I don't. And she and I've had this conversation. She and I text with each other multiple times a day so that I can be a support system for her, but I am not physically there to help her. Mary is not alone. Other families continue to fight for proper education and supports in the school districts, healthcare, residential care, community services, and most recently, transportation services continue to be a problem. Services, it's important to note that services today, that exist today, did not just pop up without any fights. Mary and her contemporaries and many people over the last 50 years or 70 years have advocated for services and supports that exist today. It's important to note that that took a lot of work and a lot of advocacy to get those services established. It's also important to note that at any point in time, they can be eliminated. There are constant fights in state legislatures and government on the federal level to cut expenses, to cut services. And oftentimes they will choose people with disabilities, wrongly thinking, well, nobody will, they don't vote and they don't have a voice, so nobody will care. Well, actually, they're one of the loudest groups and the most active advocates that exist today. It's important that we all support their fight to continue to have an inclusive life, but there is more work to be done. I'm going to end with a story that I think really emphasizes the impact of inclusion. This story took place at the Bell Center's, Bell Children's Services Child Garden School that we used to operate that I mentioned before. It was an inclusive preschool that existed in the St. Louis community for 30 years. Children with and without disabilities were in the same classrooms according to their age and not abilities. One time, the children were observing the life stages of caterpillars becoming butterflies. They watched closely as the caterpillars formed their chrysalis and emerged as butterflies. There were 8 to 10 butterflies, but one butterfly was born with one wing smaller than the other. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, kind of picture that. It was a butterfly with one wing that was the right size, one wing that was much smaller than the other size. While the other butterflies flew away, the butterfly with the different size wings stuck around the classroom. And one child in the classroom stated, "This butterfly is much like some people in our classroom. It may need some extra therapy and support, but it'll be just fine. That, folks, is the power of inclusion. This young man will grow up not looking at people because of their differences, but looking at them for their individual talents. He will be an employer and he will easily hire people with disabilities because he grew up with them, because they've been a part of his life since preschool. This is the power of inclusion. And this is the world that I want to live in. There's more work to be done, but you sitting through this lecture tonight will help spread that word and hopefully continue our mission as the St. Louis Arc to make sure to always have inclusion in our communities. I really want to thank everybody for being here tonight. My contact information is here. And Anne, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Yes, we do. So our first question is, did the St. Louis Arc or the National Arc start first? And how does the St. Louis Arc work with the National Arc? And along those same lines, how does the St. Louis Arc work with other arcs? So those kind of all go together.
Very good. So they started the same year. The National Arc started in 1950 and the St. Louis Arc started in 1950. We were both formed in the same year. We are a chapter of the Arc of the US. There are hundreds of chapters across the country. If you get services from the St. Louis Arc and you move to another community, we can hook you up with a local Arc there so that you can get services. It's important to note that each Arc chapter is independent of one another, and many of them are just purely advocacy organizations. They do not provide services. We are a full service ARC chapter. There are only 2 in the state of Missouri that are full service. There are many chapters in the state of Missouri, but most of them are very small and offer one support or offer a resale shop or something like that, opportunities for people to donate to people with disabilities. So each of them are independent. We pay national dues. I am very active in our Arc of the US chapter. I'm a part of the National Council of Executives, which is a subchapter of the Arc of the US. And as a part of that, I am the regional rep for the 4th region, which is 12 states in the middle of the country here, from the Dakotas down to Texas. And so that means that I am in contact with those in the region and serve as a resource for them. We have listservs, so we can post questions. How are you dealing with COVID? How are you dealing with the direct support professional workforce crisis, all sorts of things. And it's lovely to have access to hundreds of chapters across the country with creative minds and to share ideas together.
Thank you. The next question is, what suggestions do you have for what to say when someone uses the R word around you when you have a child with a disability?
I would be forthcoming and say that that's really an offensive word, and we don't use that anymore. It was a medical term 70 years ago. It was a medical diagnosis. It is not anymore, and it serves no purpose to continue to use that. People that use that word typically don't understand the power of language and also the damage that the language uses. I don't shy away from the history of our organization and where we came from, but I make it very clear that our name is, as written here, St. Louis Arc, capital A, little r, little c. It's not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything. It did at one point in time, but again, that changed 25 years ago, and we're not going back to that. I encourage you to always talk about language and how that hurts people, and to suggest other words that they may use that may express the things that they're trying to express. Oftentimes, our self-advocate group will actually share things, experiences that they've had and how they've corrected people on using that. And they're much better at articulating ways to address that than I am. But my reaction when I hear it in any of my talks, and I spend a lot of time on college campuses, is to address it head on.
Great. So who undid the Reagan era benefits cuts, or are we still recovering from those?
I don't think you ever recover from those. Certainly, George Bush did a lot for people with disabilities. So while Mr. Reagan did a lot of cuts, Mr. Bush came behind him and opened up a lot of doors. One of the things that's made a huge difference in terms of getting bipartisan support for legislation is the number of people that are being diagnosed with autism nowadays is astronomical. And it's hard to find a legislator that doesn't know somebody on the autism spectrum anymore. Many of them are related to somebody. They have a niece, they have a nephew, they have a grandchild, they have a brother, a sister on the autism spectrum. And that is helping to pass legislation and to pass funding to help people live a better life. And I will say that we have bipartisan support on most issues related to people with disabilities these days, where it used to be a struggle all the time.
Do you have any suggestions for encouraging neighborhood families to include my child with a disability? We feel shunned by our neighbors who don't understand how to interact with us.
That's a tough question, and you can't force people to be what they're not. What you can do is engage in things where there are neighborhood events. So if your neighborhood has a library, and I know there's actually several librarians on this call tonight, where they have reading groups, go to those. Go to things that are already open to the public and include and develop those relationships. Your chosen family may not be your neighbors. You cannot force them to be people that they're not, but I would encourage you to do things to show that your son, your daughter wants to have friends. And so in my neighborhood, there's a little tiny park at the corner of my block. And I have encouraged families to go down there when other kids are playing there and to introduce the kids and to encourage the kids to play together. The discrimination is not coming from the kids, it's coming from the parents, and the parents not understanding what's going on. I have seen on nextdoor.com, the website where you can connect with neighbors, parents saying, hey, you might see me and my kid in the neighborhood, and I just want to introduce you and us to you and let you know who we are so that people will have fewer questions when they meet you in public. There is no blanket answer as to the right way to do this. My statement to you is to always be out there, to always make the effort. If they don't return the effort, don't force it. Those aren't your people. Find the people that want to be a part of your life, want to be a part of your child's life, and that will encourage those friendships.
So, wondering from your position now, are you hopeful for progress in general?
All I have is hope. We've been through a lot in the last 2 years, and it's easy to focus on the dark side. But I recently asked my directors to send me some updates of what they've accomplished in the last year. I think I haven't gotten all the reports yet. I think I'm up to 10 full pages of accomplishments in the last year, amazing achievements. We're one organization, and I know that that's true for organizations across this country. The rate of change is never as fast as we want it to be, but it's happening, and it's happening because people want it. Families are telling us, what you did yesterday, we're not doing anymore. We want this, and agencies have to evolve and to change. I'm always excited. We're right now in our strategic planning process, and we'll have a new strategic plan by June 30th. And I'm always excited to get that input from families of what we should be doing, what we could be doing differently, so that we can start making those plans. The ARC, this ARC, and all ARCs across the country were built by families saying, this is what we need, this is what we want for our children. And we have to constantly listen and constantly evolve as an organization. I have lots of hope, and I have lots of excitement for the future of this country and for this agency and for services for people with disabilities.
I'm glad to hear that. So, two more questions. The first is, how do services in St. Louis compare to elsewhere in the country? And along with that is, how is Missouri doing compared to other states? So those two questions.
Missouri, I will tell you, is very fortunate because we have Senate Bill 40 boards, which you pay a personal property tax on your vehicle, and each municipality or each county in the state of Missouri has put it to the voters to pass a mill tax or personal property tax that generates funds to fund services and supports to people with developmental disabilities. We're very fortunate as a state to have those county boards that fund things that are related to employment and residential and related supports. And in St. Louis County, that's the Productive Living Board. In St. Louis City, that's the St. Louis Office for DD Resources. In St. Charles County, that's the Developmental Disabilities Resource Board of St. Charles County. And in Jefferson County, it's Developmental Disability Advocates. The four boards formed the Eastern Region Alliance actually in January of 2020, just before COVID hit. And they have combined forces in terms of creating one policy and procedure manual so that we can together improve the service delivery system and streamline things for families and for organizations to have better services in the metropolitan area. It's been phenomenal. There are threats right now being proposed by some legislators who want to eliminate the personal property tax. You know, sounds great. Who wants to pay personal property taxes on their vehicles? However, that could be devastating for services and supports in Missouri, certainly in this metropolitan region. SB 40 boards, that's about 19% of their funding, which then would translate to a 19% cut in services, including the respite services offered by the St. Louis ARC. These are potential cuts. So this is something that we'll be advocating for. You can look at different states and look at how funding works. Mary lives in California with Michael, and she moved out there after living here in Missouri. Just by moving into California, she was offered money to take care of her son at home. Now, Mary refuses to take any public funds to take care of her son, but people in California pay very high taxes. And as a result of that, they have access to lots and lots of services. In other parts of the country, agencies are struggling because the funding rates are very low. And I have a friend who runs the ARC in Alabama. They're struggling to get workers because their rate of pay is, $9 an hour. Well, nobody wants to work for $9 an hour anymore, but that's what they can afford to pay based on the rates. It varies from county to county, from state to state. Folks often move from St. Louis County over to St. Charles County or St. Louis City or whatever, and they don't realize that just by crossing that border, their services could change based upon their funding sources and what services are funded in that area. So it's always good to look into those things before you plan a move. And again, the ARC of the US has a list of all the ARCs across the country. So if you're looking to move someplace, you can look on their website, and that's thearc.org. And find what chapters are there and find out what services exist in those communities.
There are two more questions. The first one is, which services did the St. Louis Arc originally offer?
Mhm. Originally, it was, I mentioned this, we were doing early childhood services. So there was physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. And then we were also doing recreational services. So it was square dancing and bowling. Again, we still offer the bowling. We don't square dance anymore, but we do have monthly dances when it's safe to congregate. We don't have those early childhood services, but we have other early childhood services and access to help families access the physical therapy and speech therapy in their natural school districts.
And I think a great question, well, let's see, what do we have here? Okay, a great question to end with is, are there a couple of things you see as being top priorities for the St. Louis Arc in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, ask me after the strategic planning process is done. I have in mind some things. One of the things that we have to do is look at new housing options for people that don't require 24-hour care. So we have a lot of folks on the autism spectrum or other folks with Down syndrome who do not require 24/7 oversight. And so we have to think creatively on how we can do some housing options for those folks who can live more independently, maybe through the use of technology and just part-time help. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at. Family support is a constant need, and Ann can attest to this more than I can. That's her full-time job. And during COVID, the demands for support for families continue to rise. Throughout my presentation, I talked about how families are isolated and don't know where to turn for support. That will always be a demand, and we always have to make sure that we're on the cutting edge and providing those family supports in the best way possible. Those are the two areas that I can think of off the top. I can tell you that every single area in my agency right now wants to expand, and we will be looking at ways to do that to meet a growing need. One of the other things that we've expanded to in recent years is our Aging with Empowerment group. So when I started in this field nearly 44 years ago, the life expectancy of somebody with a developmental disability was 35 to 40 years of age because they lived in institutions and a flu season would wipe them out. Because people are living in the community, have access to better health care, have exercise routines, have employment, and are living more independently, they're living much, much longer lives. Our residents are living to their 80s and 90s. And so we've had to start some different programs for what we call our Aging with Empowerment, or AW group, to offer them opportunities to be active during the week, but not necessarily a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday thing, because who wants to do that when they're 60, 70 years of age? But maybe they want to take a ballet class, or they want to take a computer class, and you think, well, what 70-year-old is doing ballet? Well, it's chair ballet, so even I could do this. And the computer classes are helping people to access social media and develop, to reach out to family members that they may have not had contact with in a long time. So just being creative on how we're supporting people to live a much longer and high quality life.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was all the questions that we had. And I think your presentation, it was joyful, it was uplifting, and it was emotional. So I appreciate everything you shared tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Again, there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out at any point in time if you have other questions or if you just want to chat.